Welcome to today's episode of the Carbon Exposure Project. Joining us is Ana Haurie, CEO of Respira International, a carbon finance solutions business that supports nature-based project developers and corporate buyers interested in mitigating climate impacts with high-quality carbon credits. Respira plays a vital role by providing financing to project developers of nature-based solutions at a crucial time in the market where capital is waning as a result of diminished corporate participation. Stay tuned as we delve into Ana's insights on how the market is evolving. Welcome to the Carbon Exposure Project. Ana, it's wonderful to see you again. Welcome to the Carbon Exposure Project. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you.
And I'm so excited to be here. Thank you. What a great venue.
Yeah, it's a great venue.
Yeah.
So look, obviously we've known each other for a while. I'd love to use this as an opportunity to showcase to those that are not necessarily familiar with the work that you've done and then that your team at Respira do. Can you give us a little bit of background in terms of the work?
Absolutely. So we are a carbon finance solutions business. What does that mean? It means that we look to work with developers of nature-based carbon projects primarily, and we look to support them by giving them long-term offtake agreements. So we commit to buying the carbon credits that are being issued from those projects, not just sort of spot, but also forward. So in that way, they know that they've got, guaranteed revenues and a guaranteed route to market. We then work with corporates who are looking to use carbon credits as part of their decarbonization strategies. So it's quite a simple model, but impact is very much at the center and at the core of what we're doing. And that forms a very important way in which we structure our relationships with the developers, with our investors, and with corporate buyers.
And so that's a really important, let's say, nexus at which you operate. The last year and a half, I think it's fair to say that there's been a pretty significant demand destruction across the market, and certainly is evidenced by the corporate participation. The fact that you and your investors are effectively helping to provide that security via the offtakes to the project developers by being a financier is critical to ensure their longevity, right? Because effectively, the way I think about it, this demand destruction is temporary. The market's undergoing this kind of evolution, right, to build up stronger foundational elements around integrity. But without the long-term signal that's provided by financiers, it's very, very difficult for these project developers to stay solvent.
Yes.
Can I get your comment on that?
Yes. That's a very important role that we play, and this is how we're differentiated from a pure kind of intermediation or broking role.
Yep.
We are buying those credits. So we are actually at the moment in this sort of current period where a lot of liquidity has dried up. We are providing that liquidity by being the buyers, and we're doing that at a guaranteed price. So the projects that we support and that we underwrite essentially have that certainty that at least their credits have a route to market so that they're still getting those cash flows coming into the projects. The challenge, I think, that we're seeing at the moment is that the actual corporate buyers on the other side of the equation have started to withdraw somewhat from the market, and we need them to come back to the table.
Yeah, and that's really important. So obviously, in terms of tackling the security effectively for really high quality and worthwhile activities that are ongoing on the ground, essentially there needs to be that linkage between the demand side. I think there's been certainly a palpable sense in the market around turning the tide is turning effectively here. That criticisms is evidenced by, let's call it the Guardian effect. And I had a conversation with Patrick Greenfield from the Guardian, so we'll let him off on that there are broader sort of media scrutiny have played a depressionary sort of effect, or had a depressionary effect with regards to the market sentiment. But I think that's changing. There's been a lot of really strong support signals. In particular, I'd point to the White House announcement that happened recently that are really in support of carbon markets. So the question here is, how long do you think that those kind of signals take to kind of flow on to then action from the corporates to re-engage that participation in the market?
So I thought last year's COP was really positive. I know that not enough progress was made on Article 6.2 and 6.4, but as far as the voluntary carbon markets are concerned, I think there were so many positive signals that came out of that. A lot of kind of support from the World Bank, from various different governments, from the different standard bodies coming together. This recognition that voluntary carbon markets play a really critical role in tackling climate change and getting us to Paris 1.5 degrees. So I came out from COP actually feeling really optimistic and started the year in January thinking, here we go. The SBTI announcement that then came out from the Board of Trustees was like a really, really positive signal that was sent to the market. And I hope that position, sort of prevails in terms of the high level ability to be able to use carbon credits as part of scope 3 abatement purposes. And I know it's not just carbon credits, it's
environmental attribute certificates more broadly. So renewable energy certificates, sustainable aviation fuel certificates, and others. But it's a symmetry sort of impact, I think, potentially for the market, right? Should in June the SBTI go through their processes and actually advocate for that. They gave us a prelude to that, but there was a I think certainly from certain parts within people within SBTI, the rank and file, let's say, that came out against that announcement, essentially as a precursor for a decision that hadn't been finalized. But do you want to elaborate on that? I guess my question there is, like, ultimately holding back on the inclusion or the opportunity for corporates to purchase carbon credits is ultimately reductive. It's an option. It's a choice. Shouldn't it be available to corporates?
It absolutely should be available to corporates. And it's interesting that a lot of the research that comes out shows that corporates who are using carbon credits as part of the decarbonization strategy are actually decarbonizing their own operations at twice the rate than those corporates who aren't taking any action at all. And we're talking about such a relatively small microcosm of corporates anyway. I think it's something like 17% have net zero targets, not necessarily all SBTI, but net zero targets, whereas 83% of corporates aren't actually doing anything. And we just sort of seem to be focusing so much on the wrong subset. Obviously, there are concerns around greenwashing, and they are being addressed and rightly should be addressed. But I do also feel that it's probably been overblown, because just coming back to the research that I was highlighting, whether it's Silvera, MSCI Trove, Ecosystem Marketplace, the most recently We Mean Business and Bain, it all points to the same thing. They're making the same point that corporates who are using carbon credits are actually decarbonizing, whereas those who aren't using carbon credits aren't doing anywhere near as much. So actually, it's a positive action.
Mm-hmm. It's a positive feedback loop, because they're putting money where their mouth is effectively, and they're pricing that externality internally. They've got a shadow or an implicit carbon price. It's no surprise to me, or I guess to yourself, as a practitioner in this space, that those that are taking that action actually start to see a material reduction in their emissions more broadly than their competitors who are effectively not doing so. I think that's that perversity. Like you said, we're focusing on the wrong subset. We're focusing on the folks that are taking voluntary action, right? And denigrating them somehow for participating in this case. It creates a perverse incentive. What about the folks that are not doing anything? They seem to be in the clear.
Well, I'm all right, Jack. I'm not gaining any media scrutiny. I'm not being exposed in the press for, greenwashing or even indeed being sued or litigated against. So it's the much safer place now is to actually do nothing. And the sad part is that we're actually seeing, good corporate actors now actually stepping away from the market again because of the reputational risk that goes around it. So that's why, yes, if the SBTI position could remain as it is, that would be, I think, hugely positive. Mm-hmm. But you're seeing support. Obviously, the government of Singapore has been really behind and supportive of carbon markets. They've introduced the carbon tax into their ETS system. It's interesting that, every year they're sort of actually increasing the level of the tax, and you can submit carbon credits in lieu of that tax obligation. So they're really working hard to put a price on carbon, and we need other jurisdictions to follow suit. So the White House announcement was hugely positive, again standing behind the importance and the role that voluntary carbon markets should play. And maybe we shouldn't be calling it voluntary. I think it's important to highlight that corporates don't have to do it and they want to do it, but in fact, maybe they should be compulsory or mandatory. And how often do you get, private sector players saying, please regulate us?
And I think that's a really important role. And I think that there is this paradigm shift that's occurring where, point to Singapore, but Chile, Colombia, there's a number of systems in, like, for example, Japan, Korea, and others who are effectively saying, we're putting a price on carbon. That's a policy sort of direction. But carbon markets, carbon crediting in particular, not just allowance-based systems like in the EU ETS, have effectively an opportunity here to channel finance to where it can deliver impact, right, and help us to effectively balance those budgets, internally. So that thing's a huge opportunity. Coming back to something you said earlier around Article 6, I think that was the kind of conversations that were happening at COP that I think we're seeing actually now coming to the forefront. So to your point, it's not just a voluntary actions, it's this kind of hybrid effect of leveraging the lessons from the voluntary carbon markets and applying them now to compliance-based systems that we're seeing this duality emerge. What do you think of that?
Yes, no, I do. And I think what we need to do though is to actually resolve these issues. Markets hate uncertainty, and we've had so much uncertainty now for 4 years around this whole area. Corporates do want to take the right action, but there needs to be a business case for them to do it. Mm-hmm. They need to reduce their emissions, but at the same time, if it's not cost effective or you can't, the technology isn't there, they need to be allowed to use carbon credits at the same time to compensate for those emissions that they can't reduce. But we can't do it. We can't do it at the end. We can't do it in 2030 or 2040 once you've reached some sort of target, because the emissions gap is getting wider as we go. Yep. I can't think of any country that's on target with its NDC. Interestingly enough, I think the UK is probably the country that's in the yellow zone of meeting its NDC commitments. But countries aren't. Corporations aren't.
No.
So here we've got a really effective tool that's available to us, particularly nature-based solutions can actually provide a third of the mitigation potential that we need in order to be able to reach our targets, our 1.5 degree targets. And Article 6, can also play a role in that, both, 6.2, where you are starting to see, MOUs and an ICMO market developing slowly. But 6.4 can also play a significant role, with sort of kind of corporate sectors. But it's all mired and with so many obstacles, whether it's now corresponding adjustments or letters of authorization. And that all takes time to work through. So why don't we, in the meantime, allow the voluntary carbon markets to have a much more prominent role, an effective role, because essentially they enable us to do and take action now, not in 3 years' time when you finish negotiating, some subclause in some whatever treaty.
Yeah, I think that's really important. It's coming back to the urgency piece. And I think I want to pick up something that you just said earlier around the focus on not only now, but on nature-based solutions. So when we look at sort of the investment data, over the last year, I think 2023 was the story of investments really rallying along the carbon dioxide removals part of the market. Removals are really important, but without the avoidance or reductions occurring today, we just leave the task for removals to be much more significant. And I think that there's this kind of schizophrenia that's occurred in the market where focus is on the durable, carbon dioxide removals, and there's a lot of financing there. They're at the genesis. They're at the beginning of their kind of technology curve. They're not cost competitive with nature-based solutions, one. And two, like you said, the potential for scope and scale of nature-based solutions is really significant if we're trying to address this broader problem. And then add to that the time scale and also the positive impacts to the communities that benefit from the protection of these natural carbon sinks. It kind of befuddles me that there's so much focus on CDR at this point in time. Well, what's your take? Effectively, is nature-based solutions or are nature-based solutions being left behind unnecessarily?
Yes, they are being left behind, and particularly the reductions or avoidance some projects. So forest conservation, REDD+, whatever we want to call it, is certainly being left behind. And we have to have this.
That's a detriment to not only our potential as humanity to sequester carbon, right? Because these are already existing solutions, and they're at scale.
Yes, they are at scale. I mean, avoided deforestation accounts for 10 to 15% of global emissions every year. Ooh. And we've just, focused so much on the integrity aspect of forest conservation REDD+ projects that we've sort of thrown out the baby with the bathwater. And we think that removals is the holy grail, and removals are very, very important, but they're not there in the scale yet or at the price point that we need it. And we have to move away from thinking that it's either or that it's a zero-sum game. It's it's win-win. We need to do everything and like the Oxford Principles. We start now with forest conservation because that's where we've got the scale and the immediate impact.
Yep.
And then, as technological solutions and removals start to come on stream, then you can
have a transition.
You can transition. Although I think that we should never lose sight of, forest conservation, because you wouldn't then suddenly start to think, oh, we can come back to cutting down trees again. We've got to keep paying nature for the ecosystem services that it provides. And I think that we should be viewing carbon credits, it's like a commodity, it's like another traded asset, just like oranges or wheat or whatever else it might be. And it is providing a means of livelihood to a lot of communities in Africa and Latin America, in Southeast Asia, in the global south. And what voluntary carbon markets enable is that sort of mobilization of private capital, of capital flows from here to the global south on the basis of comparative advantage. So why don't we apply the economics of comparative advantage to nature in the same way that we do to where you decide to locate your manufacturing base? Although I know we're coming back now to back to having trade barriers and wanting to insource everything back home. But
it's really interesting. Obviously, there's a complexity of this solution, right? And there's such a clear opportunity for folks in this space and for more participation to occur. So the question is then, how do we encourage more broader participation and to bring back that demand side? Like you said, corporates are effectively risk averse. How do we engage them to come back in? How do we de-risk necessarily the transactions and also reduce the complexities to enable them to effectively come in? How to reduce those barriers of entry is effectively what I'm getting at.
On the supply side, we've made huge progress. And I feel that a lot of the issues that rightly needed to be addressed on the supply side are largely in hand. Nothing is perfect, right? And life is a continual process of innovation and improvement, and we don't know everything from day one. As science develops, then we can improve our methodologies. We've got satellite technology, AI. So I think that all goes to improving a lot of the issues that surrounded a lot of these projects and methodologies. The
continuous improvement.
Exactly.
We see that with the new methodologies as well, consolidated methodologies, taking into account all of this digital reporting, monitoring, verification.
Yeah.
Right. So that helps to advance essentially not only the integrity component, but just the trust that underlies these markets around substantiating those claims. So I think, but the market is self-regulating in that context. Like that was happening independent of effectively media scrutiny. I think what media scrutiny perhaps did was just to fast track some of that, just shine light on these initiatives. But it seems that it's overcorrected essentially by dissuading participation around these nature-based credits. It just seems not logical.
Well, it's a combination of both factors. So one, there's been the whole sort of uncertainty around the integrity of a lot of the projects and the methodologies, and they weren't perfect. They still won't be perfect, but they'll be a lot better, and that's okay, right? Yes. Because the function is, at the end of the day, the result that we want to achieve is to put in place economic incentives that pay nature for the services that they provide. And I don't know why.
That includes biodiversity.
And that includes biodiversity, exactly.
Yeah.
But it also includes, communities and livelihoods. It involves the whole ecosystem. And they're all mutually interdependent. I don't think that you can disaggregate one from the other as far as, the whole nature-based solutions is concerned. And just a slight sidebar, I think one of the advantages of, or one thing that we should capitalize on with carbon credits is that the biodiversity aspect of it is bundled into the carbon credit. And I don't think we should lose sight of that. Yes, we're developing, biodiversity credits, but again, they're not available now in the sort of scale that we need.
And it's also very difficult because they're highly localized as well, right? Yeah. With carbon, it's 1 atmosphere, 1 ton effectively in one location can be offset with another reduction or removal in another location. On the biodiversity side, there's not that global kind of context. It's very highly localized. And so negative impacts in one location could be irreversible. So to that point, having that duality and the kind of co-benefits intermingled around the carbon is an added value component to carbon credits. And I think to the detractors of this market that point to effectively questions around over-crediting risk and other things that then devalue, make this binary kind of assertion that the credits become then worthless, to me, just misses completely the point here, right? Like you said, it may not be perfect, but nothing in life is. There's always associated risks. And so in this case, these are additional benefits that should be rewarded as such, don't we think?
Yeah, and that's bundled into the price, because a ton of CO2 is a ton of CO2, and it should all be worth the same, more or less, right? But the fact that you've got such divergence in pricing is because of the different co-benefits that are bundled or associated into those carbon credits, and obviously also the cost of production, which is why with removals credits you have higher price points.
Yeah, one order of magnitude, if not more, in terms of the costs.
But the impact that you can make with a lot of these nature-based, particularly forest conservation projects, is hugely significant. And there are lots of different aspects that are bundled into this, so such as community sharing, revenue sharing. We should be having a lot more transparency around that. And I think on the whole we're all completely in agreement with that. So I hope that we can start to celebrate the progress that is being made, certainly on the supply side and on the integrity and trust of the supply side. And now that the CCPs, the core carbon principles, are sort of starting to roll out. I mean, I think we had the first one last week, didn't we? Yep. For waste industrial gases, is hugely positive. I'm also really encouraged that the ICVCM is sort of really focusing on fast tracking the RED Plus methodologies too, and that recognition that we've got something available now, so we can't put it to the back of the queue in terms of resolving it because it's too complicated. But I think that's largely in hand.
That's a really important point. Can we stress that for a second? It's yes, there's an acknowledgement that this is really complicated, but it is essential. And for too long now, the last 2 years in particular, because it's been so complicated, effectively it's been relegated and put to the side. We see that in the price action, and that to me is perverse. Right, because right now you're creating a perverse incentive that stimulates deforestation, because the counter is essentially, well, the cost of that protecting that forest is not sufficient for us to maintain it, and that's crazy, because we can actually ultimately accelerate deforestation by effectively diluting this type of solution. And it seems silly.
And you're seeing that with the demand side, which is what we need to really, I think, focus on. So on the one hand, they had issues and concerns over the integrity of the credits, and sadly, there are corporates who have now stepping away from RED Plus forest conservation and only want removals. And I think again, that's sort of missing. What is it? The woods from the trees, or whatever the expression is.
Forest from the trees.
Thank you.
Exactly.
Literally. And we have to reverse that. So we can't go out with headlines that say 94% of credits are worthless, because that's just not the case.
Yeah.
There are projects that aren't perfect, and yes, there is fraud and malfeasance that goes on in certain areas, but that happens in every single aspect of all economic and human activities, not even financial markets. In the church and charities, and it's not just exclusive. It's not just exclusive to this, and I don't know why we seem to be applying a much higher standard of perfection on this sector than we would on any other economic activity. I was talking to a large insurer a couple of weeks ago, and they said something really interesting. I said it's interesting because when you're developing a new asset class or a new area, whether it's like intellectual property, for example, you can make mistakes, you can get it wrong, and then you improve, and you have the next iteration, it's better. Yeah. But you don't pull out of intellectual property markets just because there were a couple of things that weren't working well. And yet with carbon markets, we seem to apply a completely different standard. It has to be perfect. And it isn't. It can't be.
It can't be. Nothing can be.
Exactly.
Yeah, so there's always got to be this risk adjustment component. So can I pick up on that thread around the insurance companies that are engaging in this space? I see a lot of innovation in that side. Certainly as it relates to, I spoke to Natalia Dorfman from Kita last time I was in London, and we talked about this kind of concept around risk. But we've seen a number of other insurance companies start to emerge and provide products. Interestingly, also on not only on counterparty risk and sort of delivery risk and sort of transactional sort of risk mitigation, but on a broader sort of subset, like you mentioned on the Article 6, effectively sovereign risk, revocation risk that's associated with the letters of authorization. Really interesting. And then also buffer pools, effectively looking to help to underwrite the risks that are associated with the issuance of these carbon credits. It would seem to me that the participation of insurance in this market, I think, can only be a really good thing, because they're effectively looking at it and saying, okay, this is a real asset class, And B, the only folks that can really calculate and underwrite this risk are the insurance companies. What do you think? Do you think that ultimately that then can help the markets to grow because of that kind of balance sheet strength, but also the governance piece?
So the development of insurance solutions and products is a big improvement and step change in the market, because it goes towards that institutionalization of this as an asset class. Insurers aren't going to insure bad products that they're going to have to pay out on. So the fact that you can get insurance, I would argue that that's an indicator of quality, right? Given the levels of the premiums that are out there. So that is adding a lot of comfort, I think, to institutional investors, as well as they're starting to step into allocating to this as an asset class.
Yeah. And I think that's fantastic. I think that's kind of the maturation of this market. Like you said, other markets are given the bandwidth to effectively evolve. And it seems with carbon markets have been around for a while. This is sort of the second real iteration of carbon markets. People call it carbon markets 2.0. But there's a really important component around that institutionalization. Because on one side, you talked about the demand side being driven in large part by the enterprise sector, right? The corporates that are essentially looking to provide that balancing act with regards to their emissions as a liability, and the asset being the carbon credit to counterbalance those emissions. Having now the institutional participation can help to unlock capital flows to those activities that are on the ground. Your work is a key example of that. We need more action of institutions participating in this market if we're going to actually achieve the scale. Because from the supply side, that's a potential constraint long term, certainly with more scrutiny around the integrity piece. So can you talk about that for me in terms of like the chasm between the financing need for, like, in terms of what that looks like, and then the potential for scaling higher quality carbon credits to emerge in the market? Because there's going to be a lag before you put shovels in the ground and effectively end up yielding the carbon credits, right? A lot of people don't really understand that. They think that there's an immediate elasticity there.
There isn't elasticity there. It's interesting that we're starting to see some positive signals from the institutional investor side, where they are starting to allocate or wanting to allocate to sustainability, climate finance, and actually to carbon markets.
Yeah.
And the development of insurance products around that, is enabling that and facilitating that, because it goes to the risk management techniques that they need to put in place. And I think that's another sort of aspect that maybe the naysayers forget. You do need the development of capital markets and capital market instruments around this, just so that you can hedge risk.
Yes.
If an institutional investor is going to deploy significant millions of dollars towards projects in Africa or in Latin America, they need to be sufficiently robust risk mitigation techniques in place for them to be able to allocate that capital, because at the end of the day, they're also fiduciaries for the assets that they're managing, whether it's pension funds, life companies, etc. So they can't just take raw exposure.
Yes.
on these allocations. So we do need a futures market. We do need a forwards market. We do need options. We do need capital markets. We need insurance too, just so that we can, essentially hedge and enable the efficient allocation of capital to these projects. So I think the development of those is hugely positive, and we need a lot more liquidity into the market. I don't think we should be viewing, financial intermediaries or financial players as speculators in a negative context, exactly, because they're playing a very important role in the ecosystem
And providing that necessary liquidity. I think you said it one time, I don't want to butcher your quote, so I'll let you say it, but effectively to deal with the lack of liquidity and the solvency. Can you indulge me with that quote? I can't remember exactly how you put it.
Oh, that markets can stay illiquid for a lot longer than companies can stay solvent.
Yes, that resonated with me. And I think that's absolutely true. So now coming back to the role of the financial intermediaries, they provide that necessary liquidity in times of need, right? And so that is essential to sustain the market long term. Without it, like you said, we shouldn't denigrate them from participating in this market, providing that liquidity purely from a speculative kind of point of view. It seems like you said, that the carbon markets are held to this really high standard that's obviously sets them up for failure. It does not apply to any other asset class. So it's okay seemingly for other sectors, other asset classes, to make profits. That's their objective, right? But with carbon, it's somehow tantamount to sort of some perverse outcome here. that there's also a profit motive. And like you said, how are we going to channel finance and leverage capital markets if there isn't a profit motive component here as well? So it's kind of reductive in my view.
And everybody participates in the profit, right? Because it's just like a commodity market. So if I can't sell my carbon credit as a producer, then I'm not going to get any revenues. But I need to have this sort of ongoing chain. There've got to be more buyers for the market. There's got to be essentially that route to create profitability and revenues, in which the communities also get to participate and absolutely have to participate. Yes. It's not just the panorama interview, put it, like, oh great, prices have collapsed and the greedy bankers have lost lots and lots of money. But so have the communities, because they're now getting nothing. If the price of a carbon credit is $1, what do you think is going to the community that's actually produced that
there's no
credit?
More going
Nothing.
to be investment in protecting those things.
Zero.
Yeah, completely. Yeah, and so we need to challenge that kind of notion. So kind of pivoting from that in terms of this changing sentiment in the market, it seems that these foundational elements around institutional participation, whether that be insurance, the broader sort of capital allocators and their appetite to want to come in and support this market, we're sensing certainly this change of markets. Effectively, folks wanting to come in because they're essentially sensing that the worst has already passed. So I'm going to ask you this. Where do you see the market going from here? Do you see it in this kind of rosy lens is what we're seeing around potential comeback for the market, given all the positive stimuli, whether that be the White House comment, SBTI, potential outcomes here, and inclusion of Scope 3, CCPs coming into effect, and effectively the foundational integrity frameworks being at least embedded, continuously being improved for sure, but continuously embedded. Effectively now, can we scale? Can we live from here, from these strong foundations?
Yes, but we need to re-engage the demand side. I think that's really the missing piece at the moment. Mm-hmm. The demand side does actually want to take action. There's corporates who do have their decarbonization pathways in place, would like to be able to use carbon credits as part of their decarbonization and strategies.
So what do they need? Do they need cover?
They need air cover. Okay. They need to know what they can say, what they can't say, how they can be used legitimately without the risk of being, exposed, reprimanded. Yeah. So we went from greenwashing to green hushing, mm-hmm. and now to green nothing, which is probably an even worse outcome.
Absolutely.
The Green Claims Directive that is currently going through the EU. There's a council meeting. I think it's next week. It's meant to protect consumer claims, but the Parliament then essentially has extended the scope of it and was trying to restrict the way in which carbon credits could be used to potentially just the 10% of remaining emissions. So, the original SBTI approach, I suppose, copying from it, which would only come into effect in 2040. So we come back to the point that we were making at the beginning of our conversation, which is in the meantime, the emissions gap is getting wider. And companies who've now stopped using carbon credits, they're not deploying that capital into other decarbonization strategies. It's just not being spent on anything at all.
Yeah, and that needs to be called out. So how do we lobby as an industry more actively and more vociferously to effectively challenge these type of perverse policy outcomes? Because there's some vested interest here that are helping to shape those. And I think that they're well not only capitalized, but they're well sort of arranged or coalesced to yield these types of outcomes. How do we provide a counter to that?
Well, I think the White House announcement was hugely supportive. Mm-hmm. I think we've really got to keep lobbying the EU and the UK market, for example. But we need to essentially give corporates the air cover that they need to be able to use carbon credits as a credible tool in their decarbonization strategy without worrying that they're either going to get potentially sued, as they might be if California SB 1036 gets passed, or just it's made so difficult because of the kind of claims that you can and can't make through the EU Green Claims Directive. I think if we can resolve that, I'd love to see more countries following the Singapore approach and Colombia and South Africa, where you can start to integrate voluntary carbon credits into ETS systems. But I have a really big ask that when we start to do that, we don't just focus on carbon credits that are created domestically, for example, within the EU, within the EU, within the UK, just because the scale is going to be so potentially limited, and that we should not just narrow it to removals. We absolutely have to integrate reductions into the equation, and we need to really keep supporting reductions. I entered the carbon markets 4 years ago when we started Respira, and I sort of found myself in my latter part of my life. I have actually literally become a tree hugger and an activist. There are so many, easier ways that one could make a living.
Sure.
But this really matters. It's probably the biggest fight of our lives, and it's existential. And we absolutely need to keep fighting the fight.
And thank you. That if that's not a call to action, I don't know what is. So thank you for your work. Thank you for your advocacy with regards to promoting nature-based solutions. The reductions component is really, really important. And thank you for helping to kind of distill that, not only the importance, but also what's necessary in order to help to achieve these outcomes. So thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.